What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in light of James Gunn's announcement about The Authority being a film that DC Studios is producing, I figured we would cover Volume 1. The Authority does exist in DC Comics at this point in time, particularly with Superman and The Authority, but it's a wholly different team separate from the one that we're going to see in the film. Hence the reason why we're covering this story instead of Superman and The Authority. We will cover that story. It's awesome. It's really, really cool. But we're going to kind of cover the origin of the traditional Authority team first. So what this does is this initially opens up in New York City, and it picks up with two people. The first one is Jackson King, and the second one is Christine Trelane. Now, here's the thing about these two characters. Them being introduced is not arbitrary. The nature of Authority is that it's actually a follow-up team. It's a secondary team. The team that came before Authority was a team called StormWatch. And the idea behind StormWatch is that they were basically a team sanctioned by the United Nations as a combination of a protective force as well as an offensive force against whatever threats may endanger the world in a capacity that they were needed, but also in a humanitarian capacity, in the sense that, like, they would help other nations if they needed it or something along those lines. But think of them as like the Justice League if the Justice League was sanctioned by the United Nations and operated on behalf of the United Nations. Now, the original StormWatch team is, by all standards of measurement, basically dead, right? They're, or at least defunct. Jackson and Christine were part of the original StormWatch team. And because the team doesn't really exist in any capacity anymore, you do have kind of like Jenny Sparks, we'll talk about her here in a second, as well as like the engineer, the shaman, Apollo, a few other people. But the thing about this is that Christine and Jackson, in light of the fact that StormWatch doesn't function anymore, they're basically, they've been relegated to like sitting in an office and monitoring threats across the world. And like, that's basically it, right? They're not really doing anything anymore. And to a degree for Jackson, it kind of drives him crazy because he misses the days of being out there in the world, protecting it from various threats. But the reason why this is so important is because they're monitoring an attack that had just taken place in Moscow, where literally some force of all these people had just flown in and obliterated the place. And so in that moment, as they're basically monitoring everything, they're met by the arrival of Jenny Sparks. Now, for the most part, they are aware of who Jenny Sparks is just because of the fact that you had the main StormWatch team, and then you basically had what was their Black Ops wet work team. Jenny led that team, right? Like the clandestine, CIA type of spy team kind of thing, the ones that operate under the radar and like kill people, just like that kind of group, right? So Jenny Sparks and Christine and Jackson are well aware of who each other is. But what had also gone on here is that with Jenny Sparks having her own team, that what's essentially happened is that with the main StormWatch team going defunct, Jenny's own team still kind of operates out there. But what Jenny is basically doing is not only grabbing her original team, but adding new people to it in order to form a new team, which they'll now rebrand and calling it Authority. So the best way to think about this is imagine you have like the main Avengers team, right, in Marvel Comics. You got Captain America, Thor, the Incredible Hulk, all that kind of stuff. Say that like Captain America had the Secret Avengers, a secondary team that was out there that was basically a Black Ops team. They would carry out missions where, I know it sounds very unlike Captain America to do, but to basically strike at people from the shadows, which is kind of what he did during Civil War, right? Now imagine the main Avengers team goes defunct by whatever manner and whatever means. Captain America takes his Black Ops wet work team, his Secret Avengers team, adds a couple people to it, renames it, and then goes forward as a protector of the world. That's basically what's happening here with regards to Jenny Sparks' own StormWatch team. So what we end up finding out here is that the attack on Moscow was led by a guy named Kaizen Gamora, who is actually at one point was an enemy of StormWatch. What he's doing here, the entire basis behind him doing all this, is twofold. One, because he's just a villain and a dick, and two, because he's trying to get revenge on the world for what happened with StormWatch. That when he was defeated, the United Nations basically sanctioned him, effectively cut off his country from the rest of the world. And in response to that, he's launching attacks against other parts of the world, basically as revenge. And so the result of this is that once the Authority begins to realize what's happening, they're not entirely aware of everything going on. It really is just kind of Jenny Sparks meeting with Swift and meeting with Jack in order to basically say, we need to start putting together a new team or bringing together this team, adding a couple more members, and then going forward from there. Now, something to know is that Jenny Sparks and the Authority operate out of a base of operations called the Carrier, and is basically a vessel that's always on the move, so they're never in any one particular location. Strategically, it's a smart smart decision because no one ever actually knows where they are. But the other reason why this is a big deal is because when it comes to Wildstorm and the DC universe in general, that it's a little different from Marvel in the sense that in Marvel Comics, you have like other dimensions, right? You have like the Dark Dimension where Dormammu hangs out at. You have the dimension of Asgard where Thor and Odin and all those guys are. In DC Comics, it's a little bit different. A dimension is a place that's slightly out of phase with the main universe, meaning that with the carrier, they can sort of enter into a different dimension, and in doing so, no one can see them and no one can track them. They, by all standards of measurement, make themselves invisible to anybody outside of those individuals who can like manipulate magic. I know it's a little wonky and it seems a little strange. It's the easiest way to explain it without going into overly complex things like hypertime and like the bleed and all that kind of stuff. We will talk about the bleed here in a little bit, but the reason why this matters is because as this conversation is being had between Ginny Sparks and Swift, there's a couple things to know. So really, when it comes to Jack, he can basically interface with a city, right? He can literally communicate with an entire city directly, the buildings and everything. And by doing that, he knows the strengths and weaknesses of the city, but he can also see everything that's happening in the city at any particular point in time. That will become instrumental here. When it comes to Swift, she's not that dissimilar from Hawkgirl in DC Comics. And that's one of the things that you're going to realize here is that these different members of the Authority are basically stand-ins in the Wildstorm universe for traditional DC superheroes. It's one of the reasons why, despite the fact that Jack isn't really immersed in like witchcraft or sorcery or anything like that, he in a lot of ways bears a striking resemblance to John Constantine, right? Outside of just the constant cigarette smoking, the cloak, right? The overcoat and the suit and the whole 9 yards. He looks like John Constantine. But what ends up happening here is they actually send Jack out into the Moscow remnants in order to investigate the city and see if they can't pick up on some clues regarding how this happened and why, because they don't know Kaizen Gamora is a part of all this. And so, of course, as Jack gets there, he ends up coming across this symbol on a building, which basically indicates that it has something to do with whoever it is that's launching this attack. You don't readily see a giant symbol like that out there. Following this, Ginny goes to visit the engineer. Now, the engineer is a cool character, but she's not the first one. The reason why I say that is that there was an engineer in the Wildstorm universe before the one that we get here. The difference is that this engineer is a girl who essentially was contacted by the original engineer, who basically gave her all this information and all this data just because of the fact that this girl was obsessed with the idea of merging humans and machines together. But what she ended up doing was actually merging herself into a machine, essentially, by liquefying all that information, all that data that was given to her, and then turning it into her own blood. There is an origin story about her, but again, it's different, right? It's different from what you're traditionally used to when it comes to superheroes. That's the other thing that you're going to learn is how these folks gain their powers. For example, Ginny Sparks was born at the stroke of midnight in the year 1900. She can manipulate electricity, but she can't create it. So it's they're a little finicky in terms of how they gain their powers and different things like that. Now, at this point, we switch over to the Doctor, also known as the Shaman. And this guy kind of pulls themes from a variety of different sources, some of which it's really not even pulling themes, it's more using themes to understand how he functions. For example, in a lot of ways, we can use the Black Panther mythos to explain the role he has. While Black Panther was just a character out there in Marvel who is part of the Avengers and has been around for decades, it wasn't until you got to the Jonathan Hickman run of the Fantastic Four that you learned about him becoming the King of the Dead and then learning, or at least using that ability to communicate with his ancestors. The Shaman is very much the same way, that much like Doctor Strange, he is kind of a quote-unquote sorcerer supreme. And I use that term very loosely here. I use that as a way to just sort of compare the two roles and to give an easier understanding of the purpose he serves. But in effect, he is a protector of the world and uses magic to do so. But he's part of a very long lineage of people who have done that. So he's only the most recent one. If and when the time comes when he dies, a new one will be chosen and they will become the new Doctor. And so again, that's why you see him communicating with those that came before, where it's literally just him understanding what his powers are. His ability to manipulate magic is massive in scale, although over the course of the Authority comics, he'll become more and more adept at it, and really more and more sure of himself, which will allow him to tap into greater levels of power. But I say all that to say, he's arguably the most powerful member of the team. And so following that, we switch over to the other two teammates, Midnighter and Apollo. Now, these two guys are exceedingly well known in the DC universe just because they were the standout stars of Wildstorm's Authority, right? They were really the more more popular ones here. Truth to tell, that when Wildstorm did Authority, while it wasn't necessarily part of the main DC universe, it became part of the main DC universe during the events or after the events of Flashpoint, when Barry Allen screwed up the universe and then DC used it to merge Wildstorm and DC into a singular continuity, right, into a singular universe. But Midnighter and Apollo have always been a really, really popular team, and even a really popular couple, because they're actually in a relationship together. It's one of the things that we didn't readily know when the comic first kicked off, but it became pretty obvious in pretty short order that these two guys were in a relationship. But it's funny because they kind of bicker like a couple does in a relationship, but in effect, they're kind of Batman and Superman, right? And in fact, in Superman the Authority, or Superman and the Authority, there's a character named Manchester Black that has the ability to cast illusions. When he meets, or at least when he comes across Midnighter and Apollo, he refers to him as like the world's gayest, right? Which is kind of a funny thing because they're like, I mean, basically, yeah. Like, I mean, you got a problem with that, Manchester Black, go over, like, there's the door right there. Get out. It's pretty cool how they just kind of own it. You know, like they step into their own and they celebrate their relationship. And so what this does is it really kind of puts them in the position of kind of being Batman and Superman to a degree. Not exactly. Apollo has a lot of Superman's powers. He's not as strong as Superman is. Midnighter is very comparable to Batman, but he's not exactly like Batman. So there's small little differences here and there. But the long and short of this is the group is basically trying to figure out what was going on with the attack in Moscow, when out of nowhere, an attack happens on the city of London. They learn about it. It was basically the 11th hour, meaning they're really too late to get there in time to stop the attack before it happens. They get there and they basically deal with the attack as it happens. But of course, them arriving on the scene allows them to pretty much take all these different guys out. Of course, it also gives us a display of what their capabilities are. In the case of the shaman, he basically uses his powers to actually transmogrify one of these, superpowered clones, essentially, by turning him into birds, right? Like literally turning this guy into birds, and his body just kind of falls apart as it becomes birds. It's pretty wonky and pretty wild. One of the things we learn about Jack, for example, is that yes, he can interface with a city, but he also becomes stronger the bigger the city is. London is one of the biggest cities in the world. So of course, his strength is proportional to that, meaning he punches one of these guys' heads off. And then of course, we pick up with Swift, who just like uses her super strength in flight to carry these guys away and tear them to pieces. And then Jenny uses her ability to manipulate electricity to kill a bunch of these guys. So again, that's when we're kind of given this display of what the team is capable of and what it is that they can do. But still, the bigger issue at hand here is, why was London attacked after Moscow, and who's doing these attacks, right? What's the basis behind all of this? And so when the team is able to overcome these forces and at the very least save the city of London from complete and total destruction, one of these soldiers' teleportation device is basically destroyed by Apollo. And when that happens, he's forced to fly back to Gamora Island to the base of operations. Of course, Apollo decides to follow him in order to get back to where he's coming from and basically bring an end to this whole conflict, or at least gather information that can be relayed to the rest of the team. The problem with this is that once Kaizen realizes that like there is a new superhero team out there that is wildly capable and was able to stop his attack in London, he basically creates a kind of force field dome over Gamora Island that keeps them safe from everybody or every other threat that's out there. Once the Authority realize this force field's there and Apollo's on a collision course, they quickly deduce that if Apollo flies into this force field, despite how capable he is, it'll kill him, because seemingly no being can penetrate that force field. Now, of course, this leads to the shaman basically using his magic to slow Apollo down. This super-powered being who's flying towards, the superpower clone that's flying towards the city, basically is traveling too fast. He doesn't have enough time to stop. He tries, but he ends up becoming a stain on the dome, right? Literally just like crashes right into this thing, and that's the end of him. Now, something that's particularly interesting here, and this was when we basically got this kind of continued explanation of Wildstorm's place in relation to DC Comics, the way in which the Doctor was able to slow down Apollo was by basically teleporting him to a different universe that allowed him to continue going until he could slow himself down. And when they do have a momentary reprieve, and the question is like, where in the world are we? That the Doctor kind of gives this little bit of an explanation where he talks about things called the bleed and so on and so forth. So in DC Comics, and really as part of the larger multiverse, while Wildstorm is in a different universe than DC Comics, although again, that changes and that will change with James Gunn's film, that the bleed is what separates the different universes. So if you treat every universe as a brick in a brick wall, the bleed is the mortar in between the bricks, right? That gray stuff that goes in between the bricks and holds them in place. That's how that works. So again, it's just a little bit of an explanation there, but a lot of new readers really kind of came on with the Authority, and so it was a way to sort of refresh its place within the greater DC landscape. And so while the Authority kind of plays a humanitarian role by sort of rescuing people who are trapped under debris where authorities can't get to them and so on and so forth, once their efforts are basically done and it's just kind of left to basically various emergency crews in order to deal with everything that's left, they kind of go back to the drawing board trying to figure out, again, who's launching this attack and why. But that's when they start to realize these guys are basically coming from Gamora, right? They're coming from the island of Gamora. And when they realize that, Ginny Sparks in particular realizes it's the home of Kaizen, and that he's literally launching this attack for what seems to be just petty revenge. At the same time that's happening, that Kaizen realizes that Ginny Sparks and the Authority are above Gamora Island, and so he realizes while it's not necessarily StormWatch, it's a newly relaunched team that basically functions almost exactly the way StormWatch did. And so that's when he's kind of trying to pick up the pieces or figure out why is it that they're unifying in any meaningful way. The team of StormWatch is disbanded, it's defunct, it doesn't exist anymore. So what in the world is Ginny Sparks doing, and why is she forming a new team? I mean, it's obvious why, because like this guy is attacking the world and a team like StormWatch needs to exist to protect the world from different threats both inside and out. Because there is a point where Earth is attacked from an alternate reality and the Authority literally steps in to protect the world during that conflict. It's pretty cool. It's called Shift Ships. It's actually volume 2. It's a really, really cool story. But the thing about this is that where you get a kind of normal display of villainy from Kaizen, where he contacts like the United Nations and is like, I'm gonna attack the city of Los Angeles because I can, and there's nothing you can do, and this is because you guys attacked me and defeated me and my people died, and so on and so forth. Just regular villain stuff, right? Nothing really unique or interesting about him. What it does do is it allows the Authority time to figure out how to infiltrate Gamora Island and take down the force field. And in fact, it's actually Midnighter who basically pulls it off. And while Midnighter is able to enter Gamora Island through a portal, what that does is it allows him to work from the inside and then hand information off to the rest of the Authority, while the Authority itself focuses on the new attack that's going to happen in Los Angeles, information that they were able to deduce and figure out. Once they get there and they make their way through LA, what ends up happening is, of course, the attack takes place. Now, this attack happens while they're basically trying to figure out how to fortify positions, potentially evacuate people, so on and so forth. And so this leads to the team jumping into action yet again, while simultaneously, Midnighter is working within Gamora Island to understand how these forces exist in the first place and a way to bring the place down. Now, what he ends up realizing as the attack takes place within the city of LA, what he realizes on Gamora Island is that this entire superhuman force that's being used by Kaizen are all basically clones. They're engineered, right? They're designed to be superpowered beings and a massive army. And so as he makes his way through there, of course, he ends up meeting Kaizen, and what this guy basically does is kind of taunt Midnighter to a degree, tell him there's nothing he can do. He talks about using a bioreactor, kind of using energy itself, kind of a limitless source of energy on the nuclear level in order to power this entire facility and keep these clones basically developing endlessly, because so long as this facility remains intact, clones can be developed forever, right? So really it just turns into a war of attrition. How long can people possibly hold out for? How long can the military hold out for? But in the taunting of Kaizen towards Midnighter and him talking about how it literally is an endless supply of clones, that it can go on forever because it has an immense power source, that's what gives Midnighter the idea that the dome is not impenetrable. An object with a strong enough force or a high enough level of durability can destroy that force field. And so what he does is he teleports back to the ship, right? He teleports back to the carrier and then pilots the carrier directly into the force field itself. And when he does that, it not only destroys the force field, it wipes out the entirety of Gamora Island, literally just obliterates it, destroys the facility, the whole 9 yards, Kaizen's killed, and all that kind of good stuff. When that happens, of course, the clone army that's being used in the city of Los Angeles, they're readily defeated as well. But ultimately, the day's saved, right? The story wraps up pretty fast. Like, it wraps up incredibly quickly. And so the way it ends is it's really Jenny just kind of communicating to the rest of the world through what is a kind of massive transition via the United Nations, meaning the team is now sanctioned by the United Nations, that they are here as a new team to basically protect the world, to keep the world safe from any and all threats that exist out there. So yeah, that's the origin of the Authority. That's the origin of this team as it exists in DC Comics. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.